This is the second part, and I've borrowed a phrase from Jeff Mulgan's book on good and bad power, the ideals and betrayals of government. He calls one section servants to the future. But I'll start with Howard and his colleagues and their generic model of therapy. They call the first stage of any therapy remoralization. They mean the process at the beginning of therapy which restores to patients some hope, A, that they may be able to recover from their problems, and B, to heal themselves. This chimes in with the views of two impressive texts on the success or failure of societies and the analysis of good and bad power. I've mentioned Jeff Mulgan, but Jared Diamond too, argue that in spite of the pressure of immediate challenges, any state which only tried to maximize the well-being of today's citizens would betray its deeper responsibility to the interests of the community, the ecological systems on which human life depends. The ideals of trusteeship, I quote, require us to become servants to the future and leave the world better than we find it. And Diamond notes that past societies that were able to survive their environmental crises were those which were actually able to re-examine their core values. Our moral functions, superego functions to us lot, which push us to act in accordance with our ideals and guard us from self-harm, operate largely out of awareness, but become conscious as the voice of conscience or a sense of anxiety or alarm. We should not be surprised that from infancy onwards, restraint to the infant's desires for satisfaction is resented, and this may live on powerfully in the unconscious. I've suggested there's a universal tendency in group life for individuals, groups and cultures to find people, structures and ideologies into which they can project their responsibilities, their superego functions, in order to return to childlike states. And the cultural expectations that we grow up in are the medium in which our individual superegos swim and develop. As the world economy and its dominant business models drive the present surge towards growth, with increasing pressure on the Earth's resources, this is probably the place to start to look for hope for the recovery of the world patient. Here, of course, reviewing developments over the last 30 years, one can only recall the Irishman's advice to the traveller asking for directions. If I were you, I wouldn't start from here. My sense is that we have wittingly or unwittingly been through a period of amoralization in Western culture. From the wartime period when the welfare state was envisaged to provide care for the population after the ravages of war, and austerity was the order of the day, we've been through a period when individual and social superego functions have been treated very oddly, dominated by splitting and moves between extremes. Demonization or idealization has regularly shifted between capital and labour, or currently those on welfare benefits, state versus the private sector. Quite why the super wealthy and their tax havens have escaped mostly so far is a source of bewilderment to me, but I think Tom Crompton has things to say about that. During the post-war austerity and rebuilding period, the state was seen as the good object and the provision of welfare and security its duty, while the markets had barely recovered their credibility from the crash and depression of the 30s. But from the early 80s, this was reversed, and the social message came that greed was good, competition better than collaboration, and that there was no such thing as society. Governments, too, were divesting themselves of responsibilities for managing their economies in a way that would properly benefit their citizens by projecting responsibility into the supposedly infallible markets on the basis that as long as inflation or the money supply were controlled, only good would follow if business could get on unfettered. Other entities to whom responsibility was delegated include news media proprietors, editors, focus groups, stock and bond markets. Two psychoanalytically inspired investigations of the social psyche in the post-war period from Eric Miller and Gordon Lawrence showed how this change in the social contract led to an experience of failed dependency with a resulting withdrawal from reality into the virtual worlds of the film, literature, and later the internet, and also a withdrawal from collective space and action into smaller groups of twos and threes in the workplace. At its extreme, responsibility for others disappears, and the only reality to be attended to is that of the individual and his survival. This is a culture of selfishness in which individuals appear to be only conscious of their own boundaries, which they have to protect against incursions from attack from those who are then perceived to contain all their own repudiated envy, greed, and violence. A world order that follows these trends is reminiscent of the internal world of narcissistic and borderline patients, where weakness of the ego is unable to integrate activity or prevent the eruption of primitive impulses. These are likely to be greedy, sadistic, or self-destructive. They're also frequently combined, as Rosenfeld and Fairbairn described, to form organizations within the self, within a society, or between nations, which mock and attack the loving, caring, protecting parts of the self. Those parts sustain the belief in love, goodness, and relationships, but in their place, the organization argues that it's better to trust triumph, narcissism, and sadism. These dynamics can be seen powerfully on the international scene, where along with the reality that power and money are aphrodisiacs, the regulators, the superego functions that remain, are usually underfunded or compromised in their roles. They powerfully affect two world challenges. Firstly, how to restrict the frankly bad behaviour of those who will defy the law for personal gain and profit, and the problem that it remains rational to grab whatever you can, as fast as you can, if you cannot guarantee that your restraint will not be taken advantage of by someone else. That's the prisoner's dilemma problem. But of course, our inherent dislike of controls will make it hard to get enforcement taken seriously. And I sort of loved the splitting involved in the idea that when Vince Cable said the banks need a bit more regulation, it was splashed over the papers, Vince Cable is a Marxist. Those who hoped that the recent financial crash would usher in a re-evaluation of core values and international cooperation on climate have been disappointed. Two psychological issues seem important here. First is the fact that the crisis threatened to affect all the major economies at once. It was there a common and sharply defined threat, as I mentioned earlier, while the effects of global warming will be patchy and uneven until far advanced. Secondly, the responses to the financial crisis have been similar to that following a serious car crash. For those close to people who are killed or maimed, there's major anguish and the world is changed. For those who escape unscathed, there may be a few miles of driving carefully, but the sense of omnipotence and immortality are reinforced, and there's a rapid return to business as usual. And of course, in the case of the financial crisis, some of the big competitors had disappeared, so Lehman Brothers' assets were picked up rather cheap by the survivors. Weaning, which is the prototype for managing loss, is complicated by feelings of unfairness, which are revived by an inequality in adult life. Globally, it seems to me that avoiding the guilt and pain of what we may have done to other people and the planet through our exploitation lies behind the argument propounded at the Seattle Convention in 1999. Namely, that in the absence of better alternatives, the present economic system of providing global enrichment through continued growth just had to be sustained, while describing, and I think this is a chilling phrase, describing as zones of sacrifice those whose environments or communities are destroyed by the process. I think one probably add it's easier if they're out of sight, far away, and therefore can be left out of mind. It seems to me that the evidence of mankind's amazing achievements and mastery of nature feeds the fantasy that more and bigger benefits can be used to avoid guilt and depression, not just about present and past damage, the zones of sacrifice, but also the pain of facing unfairness in a growth-driven world. Therapeutically, hope that is not manic or hallucinatory comes from a realistic assessment of the damage we've caused and the adoption of realistic plans for reparation. How we assess individual, organisational and national responsibility for past and present damage to the environment is complex and likely to be avoided because no one likes pain and no one really wants to have to give up anything. This connects with the view that in the West, a healthy future cannot be brought into being until we experience and consciously call to mind the meaning of significance of tragedy, both as private trouble and as a public issue at our point in history. This is Gordon Lawrence again. Tragedy refers to all the factors that are beyond our control, from unhappiness, misfortune to death. It's become felt by people now as an intrusion into their lives and impertinence. For those of us who are relatively privileged, there's always a tendency to bring our good fortune back into the realm of our omnipotence as something we've earned or deserved. And many psychologists and other observers have noted how powerfully we are programmed to attribute personal outcomes to moral matters and not to structural and economic factors. As a result of our successful mastery of so much of nature, we've come to believe that life should be trouble-free, and we consequently have poor means of integrating tragedy into our lives. We split it off into characters in films and television dramas, people not like us, into the weak, underclasses, strangers and foreigners. And this leaves the problem, it seems to me, that unless we can reconnect with the natural world itself and recognise the inevitable precariousness of our individual lives, then we cannot engage properly with these tragic elements as a public issue either. Instead, when tragedy happens, we get foolish promises from politicians like, we must act so this can never happen again. Here then we return to the interdependence of leaders and followers. Apart from the natural tragedies that no one can prevent, much of the tragedy in the world is brought about through our mindless acting, regardless of its consequences. We're particularly vulnerable to the acts of immature narcissistic leaders who promise to relieve all anxiety, but in fact being out of touch with elements of their internal worlds, only attempt to satisfy their I want wishes and desires. Such narcissistic people beget tragedy, for they enter into a course of action, unable to consider the consequences except on their own terms. In contrast to the drama of tragedy, there's no recognition of hubris or ultimate self-knowledge. Sadly, the meanest stance that's me-ness, not meanness, and the withdrawal from reality, which has arisen in the past decade or so, has also led to a fearful mode of functioning organisationally, where the strong belief in the power of collective action that I grew up into as I started my adult life has disappeared. In trying to reverse this trend away from engaging with the unconscious life of groups, and so enlivening our capacity to think and dream of a better future, we do have to face the problem of expressing and contributing to policy in a democracy. Like the loving parts of patients held hostage by a mafia in their minds, the healthy impulses of our populations are frequently outflanked by the operations, even in democracies, of our ruling elites or particular concentrations of power and self-interest within them. I believe it's the problem of how to influence policy, as well as the apathy and individual greed that have been mentioned, that can make our individual actions to care for the planet seem hopeless or futile. Hundreds of thousands of protesters against the Iraq war, probably representing about 2 million people, had no impact at all on the decision. A number of commentators have made suggestions to counter the powerlessness which regularly affects members of the professions, company boards, members of parliament, as well as individual citizens who wish for their voice to be taken seriously. Jared Diamond points out that John Kennedy completely altered what we've come to regard as the kitchen cabinet approach to government between the Bay of Pigs fiasco and the Cuban Missile Crisis. He recognised that during the former crisis, groupthink, with the suppression of personal doubts and contrary views, had guided the first decision. In the second situation, he ordered his groups of advisors to think sceptically, to raise all the objections they could come up with in a freewheeling way. He insisted that his advisors should regularly meet without him to avoid undue unconscious pressure on them to say what they thought he wanted to hear. Mulligan's suggestion is to argue that every society, including the emerging world society, needs a party for the future. I think that probably links with the idea of representatives of nature and so on, which came up yesterday. Institutions inside and outside government devoted to countering the gaps between the interests of the people and the interests of the ruling elites. I believe it needs to integrate somehow the idealism of youth with the knowledge of mortality of us older ones. The idea of such a party evokes the specialist work group functions described by Freud and Bion for the church and the army. The ideas of parties and servants to the future is an enlivening one, but like the partitioning of tasks into subgroups, there's got to be everyone's got to be constantly on guard against their marginalisation and their use to just contain that issue. So this is going to require stimulation and contributions from every level of organisation in society, from the individual upwards. For each level, there has to be a monitoring of the mode in which the group is functioning. And this is like, I think, in the consulting room, monitoring the moment-to-moment state of mind of the individual, not something you can do on a once-and-for-all basis. Is the group lacking in awareness of the problem, or is it paralysed by anxiety? Movements that want to influence states have to learn how to concentrate their forces both on welcome benefits and also on the ruling group's pressure points. Majorities, tax receipts, funding. Shame, of course, is always useful. Some major companies are well aware that environmental awareness is good for business, and public pressure crucially can reinforce this. Mulligan emphasises ways in which these mental models are different from those needed for quick decision-making, rationalisation, and the conjuring up of dramatic sound bites. And these are difficult tasks. Openness to the unexpected, respect for the time it takes to become conversant with a complex system, familiarity with many disciplines, the mental toughness needed to escape the tyranny of the status quo. They require counterbalances to the current emphasis on the tactical and the contingent. The fear of leaks that crushes honest debate, the insecurity that prevents rigorous self-scrutiny, and the wishful thinking that prefers not to contemplate unpleasant possibilities. One of my readers of this paper, an early version of the paper, said, "Okay, John, well, what's the recipe?" We'll have to work that one out. Governments have to wean themselves from their need for certain forecasts of what the future will bring, rather to develop methods that prepare them for both more and less likely possibilities. And Malgren observed that smaller countries with less emphasis on their self-importance seem to be able to do that more easily. These are enormously challenging, as we discussed yesterday, but hopefully not impossible task for individuals and states. But where do those of us who are pretty busy, don't watch television 3 hours a day, find the time for all the involvement required? Yet, contrary to the widespread fantasy in group life, to not act or speak is not to do nothing. It is collusion with whatever is going on around us. And if we avoid the challenge, then Yeats' view of leaders will be right. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Now, contrary to expectations, I'm going to finish with a hopeful view from Melanie Klein in 1959. She observed how some children have an integrating effect on the whole of family life by being predominantly friendly and helpful, and they improve the family atmosphere. She emphasized the influence of people with integrity, sincerity, and strength of character on others around them. Even people who do not possess the same qualities are impressed and cannot help feeling some respect for integrity and sincerity. For these qualities arouse in them a picture of what they might themselves have become, or perhaps still might become. Such personalities give some hopefulness about the world in general and a greater trust in goodness.
I would like to open this discussion, John's excellent paper, by underlining and elaborating his central point, the difficulties, general and particular, of following the reality principle with regard to this topic. John refers to Freud's remarks that the ego has to learn to turn away from wishful thinking and painfully attempt to represent to itself what is the case. And this is a lifelong struggle, with particular difficulties when it comes to climate change. And I see the whole of John's paper as a discussion of what lies behind these difficulties. And what I propose to do is to start with is to consider another battle, the battle over smoking, and hope to draw out from this some similarities and differences from the battle over climate change. From the 1950s, it was well known that smoking is bad for your health. Evidence of this was widely suppressed by some tobacco companies. It was also known that secondary smoking is bad for other people. Of course, smoking has its attractions. The nicotine and the psychological addiction ease tension. Cigarettes offer something for restless hands. There may be worse ways of dealing with anxiety or low-level depression. It's a hard addiction to give up. My own taste in the matter involved seeking out the 2 out of 7 non-smoking carriages on the tube trains. As a boy, I was excited by evening bridge sessions that my father had with 3 other men when the room filled with a fug of cigar smoke. But I never, apart from a kind of battle for superiority that used pipe smoke as its ammunition with a friend of mine, I never actually enjoyed smoking. As I grew older, I resented more and more having the stuff blown into my face. It gave me a slight allergy, a sort of physiological distaste to add to my psychological one. I believed we would always have to submit to this tyranny of the smoker. I had no trust in the capacity of society to overcome the inertia that allowed us to accept it, no hope that rational decisions to save people from lung cancer and other dreadful diseases would be taken. And yet change has happened. One of the most significant social changes in my lifetime. Smoking is banned from all public places. Wonderful. One can enjoy one's meal without this pollution. Fewer young people will take up this noxious habit, and lives are already being saved, as is cost to us all in the National Health Service. The massive, long-term, multifaceted campaign against smoking, with its small but incremental shifts, is an example of what John is suggesting we need to do on this much more important and difficult issue. People got together to combat the lure of smoking, the pernicious assumptions and lies of the powerful tobacco lobby, and inertia, and forced through restrictions that gradually led to the current, more healthy situation. No doubt there is further to go. There are difficult lines to be drawn between freedom and enforcement. Now, it was hard enough to drive through change here, but clearly the issue of climate change is much bigger and much less manageable. The implications of the reality principle, more complex, harder to assess, and more challenging to our narcissism. First, the demand that people restrict their smoking meant that only smokers and manufacturers had to give something up. The rest of us didn't. The rest of us stood to gain, both in the short term and the long term. With climate change, everyone has to give up something now and in the future. Cigarette smoke is visible and unpleasant. CO2 is invisible and often, in smaller doses, harmless. Another difference is this. The consequences of climate change, as of the financial crisis, are vast, much more difficult to hold in mind and deal with than a relatively isolated area of battle like that of smoking in public places. More radical and more ramifying changes are called for. As John says, the threats of climate change are also patchy. Not everyone is equally affected in the short term. John also says, so many of our inherited adaptive patterns were developed for challenges on a family and local scale. And early man survived if he could make an immediate response to a sharply defined threat. Opposing smoking calls for recognition of long-term damage, how much harder to rethink all our attitudes and behaviours in the light of threats to the earth that are so large-scale, so distant from us in their impact, many of them, and in the long term so encompassing and frightening, what might, for example, be the consequences in terms of famine, migration and violence if climate change does bring even more escalating drought to Africa. We're so afraid of disaster scenarios that we can't bear to think of them. On the other hand, less disastrous scenarios fail to trouble us enough. Thinking according to the reality principle means a challenge to one's narcissism, as John spells out in many detailed ways. We can't have all that we want. I like his linking of our attitude to the earth to our persisting attitudes, ruthless, entitled, and indifferent to our actual mothers or to the mothering we received. He rightly adds that we're not only indifferent but also cruel and punitive to our mothers. As he says, how much quicker destructiveness is than repair. And I can't resist quoting Homer to you in the Iliad, who has this to say about sin and prayer. Destructiveness, he writes, sure-footed and strong, races round the world doing harm, followed haltingly by prayer, which is lame, wrinkled, and has difficulty seeing, and goes to great lengths trying to put things right. I also like John's comments about groups, about the ideals of trusteeship. I agree, the less narcissistic person is concerned for future generations. His or her arc of concern goes beyond the limits of personal death. I agree, too, that the culture of consumerism encourages our wishful thinking and militates against our facing the facts. I think there's a danger of oscillation from one generation to the next between opposing values. As philosopher John Wisdom once said, we move from driving in the 1880s decorously round the Albert Memorial in a brougham to indulging in sports cars and decadence in the 1920s. Similarly, we move from possibly overvaluing dependence and obedience in the 50s and repression and over-respect for the superego to overvaluing competition in the 80s. John is particularly keen to emphasize the me culture that became more predominant in those years, later years. John has also some suggestions for change. One practice I particularly admired was John Kennedy's fostering of rigorous criticism of his own ideas. We need non-narcissistically to encourage the willingness of others to tell truth to power and to encourage our own willingness to do so. There's always the risk that healthy challenging may degenerate into oppositional stances driven by envy, cantankerousness, or triumph. Narcissism, as we know from our work as analysts and from our own analyses, creeps back in all sorts of ways, as, for example, and we have to be careful of this on an occasion such as this, if one becomes self-righteous and superior, or indeed excited by catastrophe scenarios. John starts his paper with his conversation with his 9-year-old grandson, and one of the questions this leads on to is how should we educate our children and grandchildren to be more deeply involved in protecting the planet than we've been? Daniel Barenboim was asked by a skeptical questioner whether children should be taught Beethoven's sonatas when they can't understand the range of emotions expressed. His response was, there are two dangers, one of pushing children to be adult too soon, to force on them things they can't understand, and the other of babying. When it came to Beethoven, he preferred to take the former risk than the latter. No one can fully understand these works, he went on. He himself has been playing and studying them for 50 years, and he doesn't. Familiarity, he said, need not breed contempt. And John ends his paper as he starts it by talking about children, those mentioned by Klein, as having an integrating effect on the whole of family life. It's not only a matter, then, of educating children, it's also a matter of being open to being improved by them. For these qualities arouse in people a picture of what they might themselves have become, or perhaps still might become. Perhaps this framing of his paper by reference to children is a clue to one message of John's paper, that it is our children and theirs that we need to focus on and rely on when it comes to fighting against the pressures to ignore the risks of climate change. Thank you.
just to start with idealization and demonization and the splitting processes that go on unconsciously within all of us. Idealization and demonization aren't just opposites. They are connected. They are systems. There's a dynamic process that goes on. And Melanie Klein, for instance, would say that one idealization is a defense against the other, the persecution and the destructiveness. It seems to be the fate of human beings to be the most destructive of all biological species, and there's something about the development of human intelligence as a survival strategy which has also gone along with the intelligence to be particularly destructive of other people. And it is this splitting between benignity and destructiveness which is, I think, central and one of the recurring aspects of the paper we've just heard. Now, some time ago in the paper in 1993 that Wilhelm mentioned on the countryside, which I wrote and tried to discern different cultural attitudes to the countryside, in particular taking the dichotomy between heath and hearth, which comes from culture 400 years ago, Shakespearean sort of view where the heath was not benign nature, it was wild nature, the domain of highwaymen and of madmen, witches in Macbeth and so on. This is quite different from the romance with the countryside, which is so typical nowadays, and where we think of the countryside as somehow embodying benign innocence from a lost past. Perhaps iconic now was that Disney cartoon, Bambi. Do you remember this innocent baby deer which was orphaned by the human hunter shooting the mother with a piece of human technology, his gun? Now, I mean, the point I'm making is that there are these cultural changes and reversals that can go on. They happen, and we have to understand if they are possible. They have to be possible in a different direction. Neither, I think, the notion of nature as simply a threat, madmen and witches, nor the notion of nature as a poor, vulnerable Bambi, a sort of Disneyfication of nature. What we need, I mean, they're both one-dimensional, would be my point. And one of the things which I think needs some attention is a balance to that kind of view of what nature is, what the environment is, what our relationship is with it, and what we can do to it, and what it does to or for us. There is a need for an attitude which is not one-dimensional. So in other words, if there is an exploitative attitude towards nature, which is increasingly condemned, I suppose, it must somehow be divorced from or hide concern as the other aspect of human relations. Also, if there is this Disneyfied kind of sentimentality, this, it would seem, must hide or defend against the other side, the destructiveness, exploitative destructiveness towards nature. Some sort of balance needs to be achieved between these two sets of attitudes, or at least this is a hypothesis I'm making. We condemn hunting whales, this ruthless exploitation of nature. It might lead us to think that the other one-sided quality, the Disneyfication, maybe we should ban Disney as well as hunting whales. Who knows? It's not entirely meant as a joke, but to draw attention to the possibility that there are other ways of dealing with these one-sidedness and the importance that we don't slip into the opposite, one-sidedness. So I haven't got a lot of time.
You haven't got a lot of
I've been
time
rather
now,
cheated of time. Let me make a point about the second main point about intergroup dynamics, in which the other group, some other group elsewhere, is seen as responsible and culpable. And we all know who that is. It's capitalism, it's the major multinational industries, who in our mind are the culpable other. But the problem is whether this kind of dynamic is not just thoroughly understandable, but may also become part of the problem. We might need to hesitate to sort of identify polluters and exploiters of our environment as simply the baddies. In case we're playing this group dynamic game of attributing all the problems, the moral culpability, to other people. I know 2 weeks ago I came back from Australia. I flew back on an aeroplane, and how much cultural, environmental damage did I personally do? Is that the sort of thing that we must pay more and more attention to? And the final point I want to make, if I may, Wilhelm, is if there is this way in which one group will use another group psychologically to carry certain experiences and feelings, are we, as people who are concerned about the environment, possibly vulnerable to being used by those who do exploiting and polluting? If we are the ones who carry anxiety on this topic, do we thereby allow other people to feel much less anxious and therefore less motivated? Do we, if we set up a moral dynamic between us and them, allow them to feel much less anxious, less guilty, less motivated to deal with the problem which we want to press them into joining us to deal with?